3 months, 4 independent appraisers, and a legal bill that had already passed $60,000, and not one of them could explain why the clock would not run. It was not a complicated clock, not in the way that word gets used to dismiss things people do not understand. It was a long case clock, standing just under 2 meters tall, built from black walnut that had darkened over the decades into something closer to the color of strong tea. The brass dial was engraved with a pattern of wheat sheaves and a single line of text along the lower register that no one at the auction house had been able to fully translate. The movement inside was hand-built, no manufacturer's mark, no serial number, no record of its origin in any catalog or archive that 4 separate horological experts had been able to locate. It had belonged to Nora Tilden's father. He had died 11 months earlier, and the clock had arrived at her home in a wooden crate packed in sawdust, and from the first morning it sat in her front hallway, it had not ticked once. Nora was 53 years old. She ran the Western Regional Office of a mid-sized infrastructure consulting firm out of Calgary, and the particular quality of her professional life was that she solved things. Not creatively, not intuitively, but systematically and completely, by understanding what was broken and locating the precise intervention required to fix it. She had spent 30 years becoming very good at this. She was not good at waiting, and she was not good at uncertainty, and the clock standing in her front hallway was, in every measurable sense, both. Her father had been a man of few explanations. Alan Tilden had spent most of his working life in the kind of occupations that kept a person moving and said little about themselves afterward. He had been a machinist in his 30s, a surveyor's assistant after that, and in the last decade of his life had lived quietly in a rented house outside of Lethbridge with a workshop in the back that Nora had visited perhaps 4 times in 15 years. Not because she had not been invited, because she had always thought there would be time. There was not. Her father died in October, which was the particular cruelty of the season, and the clock arrived in November, and she had not understood until she opened the crate what she was supposed to do with it. She had asked the estate lawyer. He had looked at the shipping manifest, looked at her, and said that the clock had been the most significant object in her father's possession at the time of his death, that it had been specifically named in a handwritten addendum to the estate documents, and that the language her father had used was that it should go to Nora, and that she would know what to do with it when she was ready. She had not been ready. 11 months later, she was still not ready. What she had done instead was spend money and time, and a considerable amount of professional patience trying to get someone else to tell her what was wrong with it. The firm she eventually hired, Greystone Horological Services, occupied the 2nd floor of a converted warehouse in Edmonton's West End, and it was not what most people pictured when they imagined a clock shop. There were no grandfather clocks in the window, no ticketing display of pocket watches under glass. The space was clean and precise, the lighting adjusted for detail work, and the benches ran the full length of 2 walls and held instruments Nora did not recognize and could not have named. The man who owned Greystone was a person named Ronald Chu. Ronald was in his late 40s, wore a magnifying loupe around his neck even when he was not using it, and spoke about mechanical movements with the specific pleasure of someone who has never once had to defend their interest in something to anyone who mattered. Ronald had looked at the clock for 3 full days before calling Nora to tell her what he had found, which was not very much and not nothing. The movement was hand-built, he confirmed. No manufacturing origin he could place. The escapement was unusual but not defective. The mainspring was under tension and in good condition. The gear train moved freely when he applied manual rotation. There was no reason the clock should not run, and yet it did not. He had found one thing he could not explain, which was a small secondary lever assembly positioned just above the mainspring barrel, connected by a very fine brass wire to a component he had initially assumed was decorative. The lever did nothing he could determine. It appeared to be doing nothing. But the tension on the wire was deliberate and precise, and the component it connected to was not decorative. He did not know what it was for. He told Nora this directly and without apology, and she appreciated both things, which was how she ended up leaving the clock at Greystone while she tried to locate someone who might know more. That search took 3 months and did not produce an answer. It produced 4 names of people with varying degrees of expertise in pre-industrial mechanical horology, and a good deal of polite professional correspondence that amounted to the same conclusion from different angles. The movement was unlike anything documented, and without knowing its provenance, there was no reliable framework for determining its operating condition. Nora read these letters at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, and thought about her father's workshop, which she had visited 4 times and not once asked anything about. Greystone was also where she first noticed the man named Callum. He was not a clockmaker. He came 3 mornings a week as part of a building services arrangement, cleaned the front stairs and the common areas and the washroom at the end of the second-floor hallway, and on the mornings he came, he moved through the space with the unobtrusive efficiency of someone who had made themselves difficult to notice. Ronald had hired him through a staffing company 6 weeks earlier and could not have said much about him beyond the fact that he arrived on time, worked without needing to be told twice, and left the space cleaner than he found it. His name was Callum Sutherland. He was 44, and his face was the kind that did not invite immediate reading, composed and specific, with the eyes of someone who was taking in more than they were giving back. He wore the standard gray uniform of the building service company and carried a caddy of supplies with the ease of a person entirely comfortable in the weight of what they were carrying. Ronald would say later, and he said it with the slightly sheepish honesty of a man acknowledging something he should have noticed earlier, that the first thing that had struck him about Callum was not his work, but his hands. The fingertips were marked with the fine circular calluses that came from long contact with brass and steel, specifically from tools that required sustained lateral pressure. Not the broad calluses of general labor, the particular calluses of precision work. Ronald had not said anything. People's previous lives were not his question to ask. What he had noticed in the following weeks was the way Callum behaved in the workshop. It was not obvious, he was not lingering. He was not asking questions or making himself available for conversation. But on the mornings that he cleaned around the perimeter of the larger workbench, and on those mornings only, his cleaning route slowed by several minutes without any corresponding change in the work itself. And his gaze, when it moved across the bench, did not move the way a person's gaze moved when they were checking for dust or misplaced objects. It moved the way a person's gaze moved when they were reading. Nora's clock was on that bench. Ronald had noticed the direction of those pauses 3 separate times before he said anything, and on the 4th time he said something. He said it simply in the way of a man who has decided the question is worth asking even if the answer is not what he expects. He said, "You've worked with movements like this before, it was not a question." Callum had stopped and looked at him with the level attention of someone deciding how much to confirm. "A long time ago," Callum said. Ronald had let that sit for a moment. Then he had asked whether Callum would like to take a closer look. Callum had looked at the clock for approximately 90 seconds without saying anything. He moved around the case slowly, crouching once to examine the base, standing to look at the dial from a lower angle, then leaning in to examine a secondary lever assembly that Ronald had not been able to place. He did not touch it. He stood back and was quiet for another moment. "Where did this come from?" he said. Ronald told him what he knew, which was not much. A woman in Calgary, her father's estate, no documented provenance. Callum nodded slowly, in the way of someone filing a piece of information rather than responding to it. "The wire on the secondary lever," he said. "Has anyone tested whether it's calibrated?" Ronald said he had not known what to calibrate it against. Callum said nothing more. He picked up his cleaning caddy and finished his route and left at the end of the morning, and Ronald spent the next 2 hours turning the question over. Nora received a phone call from Ronald that afternoon. He was not given to inexact language, and what he said was that there might be something worth pursuing, and that he would rather she were present for the next step. She drove to Edmonton the following morning. She arrived to find Ronald at the main bench and Callum standing near the clock in his gray uniform, with his caddy set against the wall, as though he had not quite decided whether this was his conversation to be part of. Nora looked at him and looked at Ronald, and Ronald made the introduction in the practical way of a man who has decided that context can come later, and that the present moment is more important. Callum said her name back to her with the directness of someone who does not waste courtesy on performance. "I can't promise you anything," he said, "but I'd like to try to understand what you're working with, not to fix it, to read it first." Nora looked at him with the assessment she gave to every new piece of information. She was not someone who made quick decisions about trust, but she was also not someone who let caution become an obstacle when the alternative was standing still. She had been standing still for 11 months. "All right," she said. What followed over the next 2 days was unlike anything Ronald had observed in 23 years of working with mechanical movements. Callum did not begin with instruments. He sat on a stool approximately 1 meter in front of the clock for the first 30 minutes and looked at it with the particular stillness of someone who is not waiting but attending. Not reading the surface but reading through it, the way a person reads a face they are trying to understand rather than simply see. He began with the case before the movement. He ran his hands along the joints at the corners of the walnut body, not testing them, tracing them. He opened the trunk door and examined the interior panels, running a finger along the back seam at the lower left, pausing. He opened a small notebook from his breast pocket. It was worn at the spine and filled with existing notation in a hand that was very small and very deliberate. He added to it steadily as the first morning passed. Ronald worked at his own bench and said nothing. He had decided early that the correct contribution he could make to this particular process was to leave it alone. By the end of the first day, Callum had removed the secondary lever assembly with a care that Ronald watched with the full attention of a man observing a technique he had not previously encountered. He set it on a cloth on the side bench and spent the better part of 2 hours examining the wire calibration with instruments he had asked to borrow from Ronald's rack, making measurements and recording them in the notebook with the same small, deliberate hand. Nora went back to her hotel and sat on the edge of the bed with the estate lawyer's number in her phone and her father's last letter, which she had read so many times the paper had softened at the folds. The letter had said very little. It had said that the clock was important and that it had been with him a long time, and that he hoped she would find it what it was. She had not understood that last phrase when she first read it. She understood it less now than she had then, which felt like the wrong direction to be moving. She called the estate lawyer. He confirmed what he had told her before, which was that the handwritten addendum had been added to the estate documents approximately 2 years before her father's death, which meant he had planned this. She hung up and looked out the hotel window at the particular gray of an Edmonton evening in early March, and she tried to remember if her father had ever mentioned a clock. He had not. He had mentioned the workshop. He had mentioned once, in the last year of his life, that there were things he had made that he was proud of, and things he had made that had not gone the way he intended, and that the difference between the two was not skill but patience. He had said this to her on the phone on a Tuesday evening, and she had been at her desk, and she had listened and thought she understood what he meant, and she had not asked him to say more. She thought, as she had thought many times in the 11 months since October, that she had been very good at not asking. Callum was in the workshop when Nora arrived the second morning. He had been there since before Ronald, which Ronald noted without comment. He had rearranged nothing. He had added several notations to the notebook. He was standing in front of the clock when she came through the door, and he turned at the sound of her footsteps with the expression of someone who has been waiting to say something and has spent the intervening time deciding exactly how to say it. He had set 3 things on the side bench. The first was the secondary lever assembly, cleaned and repositioned on the cloth so that its structure was fully visible. The second was his notebook, open to a specific page filled with measurements and diagrams. The third was a small piece of folded paper, aged and browned at the edges, that had been pressed into the seam at the back of the clock's interior panel, held flat by the case pressure of however many years it had sat there. Invisible unless you knew that seams in that period of hand-built casework were sometimes used this way. He set it in front of Nora without saying anything first. She unfolded it. The paper was very thin, the kind used for technical notation, and it was covered in pencil marks, measurements, diagrams, a notation system she did not immediately recognize. In the bottom right corner, in handwriting she knew, was a date in 6 words, left for Nora. She will understand, her father's handwriting. The date was 3 years before his death. Nora did not move for what felt like a long time. When she looked up, Callum began to speak in the measured way of someone who has determined what the truth is and has decided to tell it cleanly. The clock was not broken. It had never been broken. What Ronald and the 4 appraisers had encountered was not a mechanical failure but a mechanical instruction. The secondary lever assembly, the one no one had been able to place, was a manually installed timing lock, not a factory component, not a documented mechanism. Something designed and built by hand and integrated into the movement after the clock was made, by someone who understood both the original construction and what they wanted to add to it. The clock would only run if you knew the specific preparatory sequence required to release the lock. Not a key, not a switch. A series of physical actions in a specific order that had no written documentation and no visible indication that they existed. Every expert who had examined the movement had looked past the lock because it did not present as a malfunction. It was not a malfunction. It was an instruction left inside a machine by someone who had made very sure that only the right person or the right moment would find it. Your father built this, Callum said. Not the original clock, the locking mechanism, everything around the secondary lever. He modified this movement himself over a period of time I can't determine from what's here, but the workmanship is consistent and the intent is very clear. He did not want it to run for anyone who did not know how to ask. Nora heard this and felt something shift beneath the floor of her chest, not collapse but settle. The way a thing settles when it has found the surface it was always meant to rest on. How do you know this? She said. Callum paused for the first time since he had begun speaking. Something moved through his expression that was not quite readable from the outside, but it occupied the space where emotion sits when a person has decided to be honest about something they have been carrying for a while. "Because I've seen his work before," he said. "I know the notation system on that paper. I've used it. Your father taught it to me." The room was very quiet. Ronald had stopped moving at his bench. Nora looked at Callum with the complete attention of a person receiving information that is rearranging something fundamental. "You knew my father," she said. "I knew him well," Callum said. "For about 4 years, a long time ago." She did not speak. She waited, which was something she was not naturally good at, and she did it because she understood that what was coming required space. Callum had trained under Nora Tilden in the mid-90s when he was in his early 20s, and her father had been doing precision restoration work for a small private firm outside of Red Deer. Alan had not advertised his skill. He had taken on restoration contracts through referral only, and the referrals came from people who cared more about quality than timeline and were willing to pay for the difference. Callum had come to him through a machinist who had worked with Alan years earlier, and told Callum, plainly, that if he was serious about mechanical horology, there was one person in Western Canada worth learning from, and that person was Nora Tilden. He had spent 4 years learning things he could not have learned anywhere else. Not techniques from books, not documented methods. The particular way a man who understood materials and time and patience approached a problem that everyone else had given up on. Alan had worked primarily from instinct and from a notation system he had developed himself over decades, which was why none of the academic horologists who had examined the clock had recognized the markings on the folded paper. They were not a standard system. They were Alan's system. Personal, precise, and completely undocumented except in the minds of the people he had shared it with. Callum had left Red Deer in 2001, not because the work had ended but because his life had taken him in directions that did not accommodate the kind of sustained focus the work required. He had spent the years between then and now doing a variety of things that were not this, and he had arrived at the building services company the previous autumn because it was steady and available, and asked nothing of him that he was not willing to give. He had not known whose clock it was when he first saw it on Ronald's bench. He had simply recognized the movement as being consistent with the kind of modifications he had seen before. The notation on the secondary lever calibration wire, the specific tolerances in the gear train work, the quality of the hand-built components, the particular signature of someone who had learned precision by feel before they learned it by measurement. It was like recognizing a voice after a long time. "You knew it before you could explain how you knew it." "When did you understand it was his?" Nora said. "When Ronald told me the clock came from an estate," Callum said. "I had a feeling then. When I saw the notation paper, I was certain. Why didn't you say so?" Callum considered the question without hurry. "I wanted to understand the clock first," he said. "And I wanted to understand whether it was mine to say." Nora looked at him for a long moment. "It is," she said. Callum nodded once. He asked for another 24 hours. He asked that Nora be present when he was finished. She said she would be. She drove to her hotel and sat with the folded paper on the desk in front of her, and thought about her father's workshop, the 4 visits, all the mornings she could have asked and had not. She thought about the specific patience the lockwork inside that clock represented. Not the patience of someone waiting for something to happen, but the patience of someone building toward a moment they expected would come long after they were gone to see it. The patience of a person who trusted that it would arrive, eventually, at the right hands. She called her brother in Victoria. He answered on the 3rd ring and she did not know how to start, so she just said, "Did you know Dad worked with mechanical clocks?" Her brother was quiet for a moment and then said he had known about the workshop, that there had been things in there he had never asked about. She said she knew. They were both quiet on the line for a while, which was the first time in 11 months that the silence between them on the subject of their father had felt like company rather than absence. Ronald called her at 10 the following morning. He said he thought she should come down. She found Callum at the main bench with the movement open. He looked like a person who had worked through the night and found the investment reasonable. His eyes were clear. There was machine oil on his right hand that he had not fully washed away. The notebook sat open beside him. "Are you ready?" he said. She was. She had been ready since she read the note on the folded paper, though she would not have described it that way. Ronald stood near the window. Callum replaced the secondary lever assembly with a precision that Ronald watched with the full and quiet respect of a man watching someone do something he could not do. He reconnected the calibration wire. He made 2 small adjustments to the gear train with a tool so fine Nora could barely see it from where she stood. Then he stood in front of the clock. He opened the trunk door. He reached in with both hands and performed a sequence of actions that were not random and were not obvious, and that, if you did not know they were a sequence, looked like nothing in particular. He adjusted the pendulum suspension by a specific increment. He applied a very light lateral pressure to the left side of the movement plate and held it for a count of 3. He released. He reached to the winding arbor and made a partial turn to the right, stopped, returned to center. He closed the trunk door, he stepped back, he wound the clock. The clock began to run. The tick, when it came, was nothing like the sound of a clock simply operating. It was the sound of a mechanism that had been built for that moment specifically, the pendulum finding its arc with the ease of something that had always known the motion and had simply been waiting for the correct condition to enter it. The sound was quiet and even and entirely certain of itself, and it filled the workshop in the particular way that the sound of something very old and very precise fills a space. Not loudly, deeply. Nora stood with her hand against the side of the walnut case and felt the vibration of the movement coming through the wood and into her palm. She stayed like that for some time. No one in the room spoke, which was the correct response to that particular moment, and Ronald and Callum both seemed to understand this without being told. When she finally turned around, her expression was the kind that has passed through something and is still finding its way back to the surface. She looked at Callum, who was watching the clock rather than the people in the room, his expression contained in the way of someone letting a moment be what it is without adding to it. "My father chose well," she said. Not about the clock, he understood what she meant. Ronald left them alone in the workshop, saying something about a call he needed to return, which was probably true and also considerate. Nora and Callum sat on opposite sides of the bench with the sound of the clock behind them, and she asked him the things she had been carrying since the previous morning. He answered them without deflection. After leaving Red Deer in 2001, he had worked in a succession of settings that made use of his mechanical aptitude in diminishing increments, service technician roles, equipment maintenance, a brief and disappointing period in the restoration division of a company that turned out to be far more interested in appearance than accuracy. He had contracted through building services for the better part of the last 5 years. It was not a fall he had engineered for himself. It was the cumulative result of choices made in difficult years that had eventually produced a kind of baseline stability that asked little of him, which had seemed at the time like what he needed. "Do you miss it?" she said. He looked at his hands on the edge of the bench. "I missed it before I stopped," he said. "By the time I stopped, I had already been missing it for a while." Nora thought about this. She thought about her father working in the workshop in Lethbridge in the last years of his life, the mornings he had put into that movement, the patience of building a lock that he knew she would encounter only after he was gone to explain it. She thought about the 6 words on the folded paper, "She will understand." He had not written "she will figure it out" or "she will have it repaired." He had written "understand," which was a different word entirely, and she was beginning to think she was only now reaching the edge of what it meant. "There's something I need to ask you," she said, "and I want you to know before I do that you are not obligated to say yes, and that the answer does not change what I think of what you did here." Callum looked at her with the level attention she had come to recognize. She ran a small private advisory division within the infrastructure firm that was nominally about asset management and was actually in practice about saving things that were at risk of being lost because no one had paid them sufficient attention. Complicated things, old things, things that required patience and specificity and the willingness to sit with a problem before deciding how to approach it. She had been looking for some time for someone who understood that the first step in working with something of genuine value was not intervention but comprehension. She was not certain how to put a job title to it. She was not certain a job title was the right frame. "What I'm saying," she said, "is that my father trusted you with something he could have told me about himself and chose not to. I'd like to understand why. And I'd like to understand it with you, if that's something you're willing to do." Callum did not answer immediately. He looked at the clock. The pendulum moved in its steady arc, indifferent to everything in the room except the calibration it had been waiting 40 years to express. "I'd need to know more about the work," he said. "So would I," she said. That was where the conversation ended and where something else began. The following week, Nora drove back to Lethbridge and went to her father's workshop for the first time since the estate had been settled. The building services firm had been asked to forward Callum Sutherland's placement to a new assignment. He had received the message on a Tuesday and had needed some time to think about what it meant. He thought about Alan, who had been the kind of man who taught by doing and trusted by waiting, who had handed Callum a file and a reference block on the first morning of his apprenticeship and said nothing more than, "Take the time to understand what you're working with before you decide what it needs," who had never in 4 years told Callum what to do or how to be, who had, apparently, spent the last years of his life building a clock that would eventually find its way to someone with his hands. Callum had spent a long time wondering whether the things he had learned still lived in him in any useful way. The answer had turned out not to require wondering. It had required a stool, a notebook, and the willingness to sit in front of something he did not yet understand and wait until it showed him where to begin. He wrote back to the placement coordinator and said he would not be continuing with the building services contract. The workshop in Lethbridge was exactly as Alan had left it, which meant it was very clean and very well organized and entirely full of things that Nora could not have named 6 months earlier and still could not name now, but was beginning to understand she was going to learn. On the workbench in the center of the room, covered in a canvas cloth, was a second clock, smaller than the long case, different in construction. She could see from the outline that it had not been finished. There was a note under the canvas in the same handwriting as the folded paper in the same pencil. It said, "This one I ran out of time for. I thought I might, which is why I made sure you'd meet the right person first." Nora stood in her father's workshop in the particular slant of late afternoon light that came through the west-facing window, holding the note in both hands, and understood for the first time what he had meant when he had told her she would know what to do when she was ready. She had not known. But she had found someone who did, and her father, who had trusted in time and patience and the reliability of the right hands finding each other eventually, had known that was exactly the same thing.